So you're in an edit suite and you just can't get your show to work. You've moved around sections, you've tried a few editing tricks, but the show is still flat. And we've all been there.
Part of the thing is normal in that it's really tough to tell a story. People don't have the craft element of storytelling much anymore. And there is a real skill to it too.
If you're a working or aspiring documentary filmmaker and you know your stories aren't yet at the level of the films you admire, this show is for you. I'm Nigel, Levy, creator of DocFix, a practical storytelling system developed from decades at the highest levels of documentary and factual filmmaking. I've worked with Oscar, Emmy and BAFTA-winning teams across genres, including series editing Netflix's Formula One Drive to Survive, producing and directing Emmy-nominated feature documentaries, and writing for Sir David Attenborough. In DocFix, we break down how world-class documentaries are actually built, so you can turn your ideas into festival and broadcast-ready films without film school. Today's episode is a little different. I'm being interviewed by Craig Colby at the World Congress of Science and Factual Producers about one thing: how to fix your doc when you're stuck in the edit. We get into why so many documentaries fail at the structural level, how to think in acts and arguments instead of just chronology, and how I applied this approach on projects like Drive to Survive and the Meerkat film narrated by Sir David Attenborough. That done, here's the interview.
So you're in an edit suite and you just can't get your show to work. You've moved around sections, you've tried a few editing tricks, but the show is still flat. And we've all been there. That's often when Nigel Levy gets the call. He's worked on the stage, on Hollywood movies, he directed Sharon Stone, and in documentary, and he is an expert on storytelling. Nigel, how do we end up at that point in the edit suite?
Well, it's incredibly common. I think it's happened to everyone. It certainly happened to me. And part of the thing is normal in that it's really tough to tell a story. You've got a complex amount of material, huge amount of material, lots of different meaning in it, lots of reasons you filmed it that it meant something to you. And you're relying on your talent and gifts and everything that you have to try and make it work. But for the reasons why it doesn't work, in an absolute sense, I think there's people don't have the craft element of storytelling much anymore. And there is a real skill to it too. And part of that is probably there's less mentorship. Certainly it's the case, I think, in the freelance world. You work on something, you make it work, and then you move on. So there isn't the constant feedback. You're not learning from people who've been through the problem so many times before, and you learn all the tips and tricks and things. Another more subtle reason is probably, I think this is the case from certainly the people I've worked with. Some people think it's inauthentic in a way to plan too much. So they like the spontaneity of going out. If you're making a certain type of documentary, you want to go out and cover it and discover the truth of it and experience it, and it will reveal itself to you as you shoot it. You shoot a lot of material, and you bring it back, and then you try and find the film. And they might do it because they're feeling it's more honest that way. But what you often end up doing is just putting in a timeline, and the poor editor, and I know a lot of editors who've been through this, it's their job to kind of solve it with you, and you have the struggle. You end up with things like a list. If it's not working, you cut it faster, use music a different way. You try to manufacture dramatic moments. It's kind of superficial, and people know it's superficial, but they can't get to the bottom of the problem. They can't see, is there a way of really understanding what's going on and fixing it at a kind of fundamental level?
Yeah, when I took scuba diving, there's a phrase in there that I've borrowed, which is plan the dive and dive the plan. You can never really plan enough beforehand. So it sounds like even with the best producers and directors, if you haven't planned it out enough to really understand what your story is, it's gonna catch up to you at some point. Usually when you're under the hood, trying to get this engine running. So with that in mind, what can people do about this?
Well, traditionally, I mean, people are interested in story. There's certainly a lot of people out there who want to know more. And I was the same. And you go to drama. Really, you think, the truth is there in drama. That's where we can find the answers. And that's why I worked in drama, to kind of see if the truth was there. My background is as a factual filmmaker, but I worked in theatre. I've directed, feature films. And what I found after all the seminars and courses I went on with people is there is a fundamental difference between drama and documentary. And in drama, the difference I found is that the people who are writing or creating drama often have an idea, something that really means something to them, and they're trying to create reality out of that. They're trying to create scenes that are real, scenes that represent this idea. Ultimately, they're judging everything on the meaning and on the value, and does it show, is it a meaningful way of representing what my concept is, what I want this film to do? In documentary, you can get fooled by the reality. So you think, oh, that's exciting to me, that subject matter matters to me, and you don't do the actual work of making sure the structure of your film delivers the meaning you want. You assume it's going to be delivered. So there's a fundamental difference. Drama takes an idea and creates scenes from it, and documentary, you've got reality, and then you have to have the skills to make it meaningful. And failure, 90% of the failure of films or documentaries when they're not working is that kind of organization. It's structural. It's you haven't taken that material and created something meaningful out of it. You haven't done that work, and that's a craft, as it were. That's a skill. There are techniques.
And you talked about dramatic structure. A lot of us have been trained in the dramatic 3-act narrative. How applicable is that to documentary?
I don't actually think. I think it's 4 acts. Well, that's what I teach. It's 4 acts. I'm absolutely certain it's 4 acts, and there's a lot more stuff going on.
I took English Lit. There were 3-act, 4-act, 5-act, and I've seen an article recently that was really pushing for 4-act. But still, even with the act structure, how much does that apply to doc?
Well, a huge amount. If you look at it a different way, I think the difference is when you're dealing with a documentary, you have to look at it a different way than you would if you were producing a piece of drama. I think that's the key thing. So, like I said, part of the problems occur when people assume they just put on the timeline. This is roughly the chronology of the event that I'm talking with, and I will use my techniques and skill to make this work and make it just sing. There's another way of looking at a story which is much more fundamental, and that's about the argument. It really comes down to the argument that you're making. So. The best analogy I've heard is if you can imagine people are sitting around a pub and they're talking about a problem, because stories are a way of seeing whether a solution to a problem works or not. This is the problem, how do we solve it? So the truth is, if you've got a number of people around a table in a pub and they're talking about a problem, everyone's going to have a different approach to that problem. So some are going to, in football, and I've done some sports documentaries, so that's a kind of a valid one. In football, if a team isn't winning, some will look at the tactics, the fitness, the training, all the physical stuff, all the external stuff. And other people are going to be talking about the state of mind of the players and how you coach them, how you manipulate them. So there's a kind of a physical realm of the problem and a psychological one. If you're talking about, the COVID pandemic, again, you'll have this richness of opinion. You'll have some people were talking about how do you create a vaccine? How do you physically create it and get it to where you want to go? Other people can say, no, the real issue is how do you persuade people to take it, or how do you make them think about it a particular way, or how do you deal psychologically? So they're all valid, but you're dealing with a problem in kind of a multiple contexts, the kind of external physical world and the way people think. And when you use that understanding, what you can do, you can apply it to a story to make sure it feels rich and complete. You're not leaving gaps in your storytelling. And another level of sophistication in that is that you actually end up with acts themselves, because when you're looking at the psychology, there's kind of a series of steps you go through psychologically, or when you're doing in the physical world, when you're trying to act on something, there's a series of steps. And what an act is taking your audience through the necessary steps to work through that argument. And that's that kind of feeling of movement you get, and inevitability. And then you have to kind of design things about the inciting incident. You have to design your climax. You can design what you want your audience to feel. What's meaningful? What are the themes? What's the thematic argument? Now, that's kind of a lot of stuff you're dealing with, but it feels, in the end, there's only about 15, 20 things you're kind of working on, giving people the tools to use. Take all those, take a step back from your material and really be objective and really look at it and see, what am I trying to do with this story? And that's kind of the approach that I take when I'm fixing and when I'm teaching people how to fix it. And it works like when you're developing your idea right from the beginning. When you've had an idea, it tells you what kind of idea you've had, how you write. You go from a log line to 1 page to 5 pages to pitching it, the pitch document, how you arrange your shoot, of course the edit, but even to the publicity at the end. It's like what you say if you've got a poster, the language that you use on the poster, all those things reflect the meaning of your documentary. And it works for any subject because it's such a fundamental approach.
And what you're talking about, I've heard you say this before, you're talking about authoring. You should really think about what you're doing as authoring something. Let's get into some of the nuts and bolts of that in just a sec. Right now, what problems did you experience with meerkats?
Well, that was a really interesting one because obviously they're hugely skilled in that area. And I was brought in because they'd been editing for a few months and had got a few minutes working, maybe 10 minutes working out of an hour film, and the rest of the film really wasn't going anywhere. That's a classic thing, the commissioning editor's notes were saying, well, the first 10 minutes is working, then it's not working, and there'd be a list of suggestions going down. It's not happening, and it just seems like a list, and I can't see the point of it, and we end up somewhere, don't know why. So absolutely classic problem. And that was a really interesting story because on one level, it was a really complicated problem that you had to identify. And what was actually going on, that story was about a classic meerkat story, a classic meerkat drama about this bunch of meerkats and how they survive in the wild, and the story of the scientists who did the research on meerkats in the Kalahari and how they learnt about meerkat behavior. The problem was, and what people didn't realize, and it was very clear to me, was that there were actually two completely different stories in there. Because a program or a film or a piece of work in itself is a container for something. And in this case, there were two completely separate narratives. The problem was that they'd been editing it as one narrative. So they're trying to connect the two all the way through. They knew they had to connect the two and they had to go from one to the other. Otherwise, the reason for making the film had failed. They can't just show one film and then another. But they hadn't realized that there were two completely different kinds of story. So in the cut that we've just seen, what you'll see is that the meerkat story, the language in there, in the version that I created, is very much about the circumstances that those meerkats are in. So, Clinky is pregnant, there was a dry season, there's more coming on the way, there's predators. That's about the circumstances. It's a particular type of, physical problem. And what was going on with the scientists, it was a completely different kind of overall story, which was about the activities, what they did. They're studying behavior. Students are setting out to weigh and record and measure and all those things. So completely different kinds of narratives. Now, when you've clarified that you're dealing with two stories, and then you can work out, okay, in the meerkats one, these are our 4 acts. This is what the climax is. This is how we set it up. In the scientist thing, this is their narrative. Suddenly, well, not suddenly, but it's quite fast, everything slots into place. And all the material that they've shot, all this beautiful material, can be made to make absolute sense. And even the great thing about having this kind of understanding of the fundamentals is it affects everything you do as a director. So if you'll remember in that sequence, you had the meerkats were getting up in the morning and you had all this very atmospheric music. Tonally, the choice of music we changed to kind of give a sense of the situation and the circumstance. And then it transitioned over that lovely alarm clock and the meerkat popping up so you can get a transition working into something that was the music was faster. It was more about activities. It was cut differently. Tonally, it was done differently, and it was done that to support those two different arguments. And then you just work through it. You work through the two narratives. You make sure that you're going through each act. And the editor, who'd before then been struggling and trying to connect one story or one element of the same story to the next element of the same story, building this kind of jigsaw railway line thing was free just to kind of make those two stories work. And it became, what's strange and what always happens is when you get it right, you start finding connections that just work. That transition, that edit, wasn't in the original cut. I imagined it was, and I went back and checked, and it wasn't. But it works beautifully, and suddenly you find connections between the material because the story works. Everything is like, every moment is like anchored into something meaningful at the bottom. Every choice you make has a subtext to it, and it's a hugely satisfying feeling when it all works.
And not only do you have two stories, but suddenly you have two chronologies you have to manage in that too. What role does chronology play in our documentary storytelling?
I think chronology should be the last thing you worry about. I think people get fooled by chronology because chronology is inherently meaningless. Chronology, it seems like when you're doing a chronology, you are following a sequence of events as it happened. That's all that chronology does on the surface, but there's no meaning to that. That's the problem of when you lay out your edit in the edit suite and you look at the timeline, you put it all on the timeline thinking, that's just a list. I know it all happened in that order. How can we make it work dynamically? If you can step back from chronology and say, what's the meaning of this we're trying to do? You have this huge freedom of moving whole sequence and sections to a different part. And it just frees you up completely, not to get tied to chronology. Ultimately, there is a chronology, but don't think that the order that things happened or you imagine things happened tells you the story is meaningful in itself. I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit complicated, but...
Well, what do you mean by the order things happened and the order you imagined things happen?
Well, when you have a chronology, you think things happened chronologically, but they don't. People are making decisions over before they choose to do something. A lot of things happen parallel all at the same time. A lot of events happen simultaneously and they reveal themselves to have occurred, one thing after another. And you're making choices, but they're uninformed choices about when you lay out chronology, you're making a choice about how you think things, the order in which things happened. But you're doing that without any meaning attached to it. So you can just have a sequence of events. Someone decides to do something, then this thing happens. But also, you've got a situation that's bubbling away that forces someone to make a choice that causes the thing to happen. There are different ways of representing a chronology. And the problem with chronology is if you do that at the beginning, there's no meaning inherent in one thing following another. Our lives have one thing following another. If you're telling someone a story about your day and you want to make it a great story, you don't start by saying, I arrived at 9 a.m. at this dinner. And I remember at 9:15, we ordered, we went to the menu and this happened. And then, at 9:45, this amazing thing happened and this happened. And then over dessert, you jump straight into the dessert story. If that is how you want to start your story, then you jump to later in the evening, then you go back to the main course. You are making, in real life, you don't use chronology to tell stories. You kind of find a way of giving meaning, and good raconteurs do that all the time. They kind of move time around because it's not the time you're telling, it's the impact of the narrative that you're trying to get working. And I think we can just get fooled by chronology sometimes.
And we've obviously we've seen that in a ton of classic films, from Pulp Fiction to Citizen Kane, where they jump around. They use chronology as a tool to tell their story.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting thing with that because there's a plot. So when you worked out the meaningful narrative that you've created, there is obviously a sequence of events. One thing you've chosen what goes after the next, chosen after the next, chosen. So that is one thing you've done, the plot. How you deliver that plot to the audience, you can play with it, because at the end of the film, the audience will have pieced it together in the right plot order. But the impact of that material, it's like, is different. So there are, again, it's, Memento, the Christopher Nolan film. There is a plot to that, in that someone is I believe, because it's a complicated film, is brought into a crime and commits a crime and can't remember what he did and so on. But obviously it's played backwards. But I am absolutely certain that Nolan, when he wrote the plot in the right order. And that made absolute sense. And then thought, wouldn't it be really interesting? And he did it. And, I think Harold Pinter did it as well in something. You do the whole thing in reverse. Because at the end, the audience, if you ask the audience what the story's about, they'll tell you exactly the correct, meaningful order of the story. How you deliver it is the fun you can have manipulating your material. So
Christopher Nolan's a great one to look at for that, because he's done it several times.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be, you've talked about people feeling honest. You can still be very transparent about moving chronology and still tell your story. You can serve both masters there easily.
Yeah, absolutely, because the audience know that they are being delivered a meaningful piece of work, and they enjoy it. And at the end of your film, everything comes together. You have a climax that is delivering the meaning, the kind of tone, the statement you're making about what matters to you about all this material. That's delivered to you. If you know what you're doing, really neatly at the end of the film, you can design how you want your audience to feel. You can create a wonderful, optimistic, triumphant ending. You can create a tragedy. You can create, a personal tragedy. There are various. Again, it's a skill. The wonderful thing is it's learnable. It's not. Mm-hmm. It's got nothing to do with your talent per se. There's a kind of hierarchy, and I tend to teach. The way I teach is these are the fundamental skills that you can learn if you just do the work, concentrate, practice them. You will learn those skills of techniques of identifying. You'll instinctively begin to identify what your story is about. You can design the ending. This is what an inciting incident. This is how you transition between acts and so on. As you build up this hierarchy, you get to the end, and a lot of people confuse. The language is confusing, but I call it kind of story decoration. It's like the stuff you do to make what you're saying fun and exciting is like turning a scene so there's great suspense or shock or horror or comedy. That you have to layer onto something that's foundationally correct. It's like architects. Frank Gehry with his extraordinary buildings that lean in all sorts of directions. The most important person there is a structural engineer, because if they haven't got the foundations deep enough, or they don't know the weight that the steel will hold, you have a very expensive pile of rubble. And the other thing about engineers is they don't argue about the structural integrity of concrete or steel. It's like our job is to get the calculator out and make it sustain, make it stand up, because that is what we need to support all this astonishing choice of materials and reflections and moves and shapes, and that's kind of this level of storytelling you're at. It's fundamental, it's learnable, it's skillful, and you never really argue. That's the pleasure when you're in an edit and you are doing this stuff with someone else. It's so much more relaxing, because when you're really clear about what you want this story to be about, there's a bit of discussion, but yes, of course, that's what we want it to be about. And that's what we want people to feel at the end. And this is the problem of the story. And this is what matters. It's then unarguable statements when you're clear. How you do it is like, I hate that music, or right. Cut it faster, or, people argue about lots of things. But, the great joy of these techniques is the calmness it brings to the whole process. And everyone deserves a bit of calmness, because filmmaking is hard enough as it is, and if you have a commissioning editor and you can explain to them clearly what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you want to achieve it, everyone is just so much more relaxed and more creative. Just everything is more fun.
We'll be back in a moment, but I just wanted to jump in and remind you about the DocFix storytelling program, which is the reason why I'm releasing these podcasts about the process behind creating meaningful documentary stories. If you want to find out more about the program, which is here to help anyone who's struggling to turn an idea into a great story, you can go to apply.thedocfix.com. I'll send you a case study where I go over exactly the process I use when working on stories such as the Netflix series Formula One Drive to Survive and Sunderland Till I Die, script writing for Sir David Attenborough, and the various feature documentaries I've made throughout my career. Of course, if you have any questions at all, I'd be glad to help.
Let's take a look at a really fun trailer for a Formula One program that you worked on. Let's take a look at that now.
30 seconds. 30 seconds. These guys have an almost fighter pilot mentality, and that's what separates them from mere mortals.
All I ever do is pray for a safe race. I never thought that I'd be there one day watching my son.
For me, it's heart attack after heart attack.
Are you okay, Nico?
Yeah, there's fire. There's fire.
I love the danger, that adrenaline and that excitement.
They have crashed! They've gone into each other!
I'll do anything I can to get the best results possible. I'm not worried about dying.
So this seems like unnatural. You have the Formula One race. You have, all the drama of the racers and everybody trying to win. What problems do they experience on this show?
Well, it was, I came in fairly late there. They were still shooting, and it was kind of a spectacular. The material was amazing, and it was kind of. In some of the edits, they were still putting the stories together. Some of them were working, some of them weren't. So it was really about getting clarity to the process and just really delivering and just helping the edits deliver. And the example is, it's interesting because I just come off Sunderland Till I Die, which was a soccer show. And I'd realized in making that for the same, for Netflix, for the same department, how clarity was incredibly important. So one of the things we really had to do was kind of sort out the clarity. And I did bring along a few tricks. And, one of my tricks that I came up with Sunderland Till I Die, and I stand by it as being completely ethical, is you get the great thing about sport is you have commentators. And there were no voiceover in any of these documentaries. I said, okay, we're going to use the commentary to help move the exposition on. So we wrote commentary for the racing commentators to explain little moments, to move the story on. F1 is incredibly complicated. So you'd have a commentator, you'd write a line saying, if his tires don't hold out, he's going to drop from, third to fifth by pitting now. Stuff like that they wouldn't normally say over a very long race, but we needed that moment. So I brought into it the tools of clarity, the things to help the exposition where they were kind of struggling to kind of find a way to express the complexity of Formula One. And some other bits and pieces like how you use journalists and how you use interviews. But what I also liked to look for was the multiple layers of narrative that you can have in a single story. You remember everyone sitting around the pub and they say, the reason he's not winning is because he's not very good at overtaking and his tires are giving out and they're changing wheels really badly. And there's a whole kind of whole series of kind of events and activities and things. But there's also the emotional narrative. Or let's say the mental narrative, that's really an important part of the story. And what you can find is often in pitches, you kind of list the kind of things that you want that are going to be in your film. You'll say, and we'll have really emotional moments, and we'll get to the heart of who these people really are, and we'll see them struggle. And that's a statement. But what you actually do have to design that into a working narrative. And in a funny way, Attenborough, when it was fixed, was more straightforward because you had a 50-minute film, but you had two narratives there, so they're 25 minutes each. So I could only make sure the overall story was making sense. In F1, we could go deeper and richer because over a kind of similar-ish amount of time, you've got the physical narrative, you define what the overall story is. And then when you get into the emotional narrative, it was about really bringing that rigor of creating acts and sequences of scenes and proper resolution for the emotional narrative as well, or the kind of the different narrative. So if you're doing the physical thing over one area, you have the psychological realm that you're dealing with a couple of different narratives. And it's about really making sure that that was a full narrative with beginning, middle, and end. And what that means is when you have those layers you're working with, you can emphasize one layer above another layer. So you can make a film about a race, for example, and you don't emphasize the winning position, like where they ended up. You're actually saying, no, the story is about the approach or the approach that this person took mentally to try and get to a position where they could or could not win. And you're resolving the mental state of the driver through the story. So what that allows you to do by being able to manipulate those layers is you have a completely different feel. So the problem always with those kind of documentaries and the sports documentaries is if you don't know how to work with material, you tie yourself to the event. It's always about where do they come, who wins, who loses, do they win the match, do they win the race? And over 10 episodes, it's like you're telling the same story and you think there's not enough going on here, there's not enough variety. But actually, if you can delve in, if you can find the other argument, like I say, people around the pub, and some are saying it's like, oh, the reason they're not winning is because they've got a dysfunctional management team or something. So let's tell the dysfunctional management team story. You've still got the same elements. You're still dealing with, it kicks off, the race begins, they herring around the track and all that kind of stuff. That's all those things that people love about Formula One in this case are there, but you're actually telling a different story. You're emphasizing a different narrative.
And so you're talking about two problems here, right? Like you've got, you're talking about the external problems in sports, which is, are they going to win, and things they have to go through to win, but the internal problems as well. So you have to identify your potential for drama is in a couple of different places, both the external and the internal, correct?
Absolutely, and it's the case with every problem. And the reason why this is universal is like any problem that you talk about, there's pretty much, actually, it's interesting, not every, I explain why, but most documentaries you deal with on a fundamental level are dealing with a physical issue and kind of the internal problems as well, the human issues and the external ones. What's really interesting is you can use it, because it's so fundamental, you can use it for subjects that seem to have no character, no inherent drama by the dramatic definition. If you're making a science documentary about an abstract concept, you can organize the nature of the argument in how you deliver that material. So you can talk about the physical circumstances of the universe or something, and there are stages of that discussion that you can follow. So the audience are being taken through an argument. So you're giving order to something that if you don't have that, it feels unordered, it feels not meaningful. So subjects that have no apparent character, you don't have to kind of find people and shove them into a certain kind of documentary to give it meaning. You can actually step back even further and say, okay, if this is an argument purely about the state of things, is there a sequence of, is there a way of moving through that argument logically and inevitably and in a way that the audience find necessary and like satisfying? So absolutely there is. I mean, everything's got its own, everything's got its own nuance and tweak. And some shows are like, Funfair rides, or, some are just about the experience. But I think having the knowledge to create a complete story, a really rich, that has everything in it that you could possibly want, 4 through lines, inciting incident, it resolves with the right climax, every act works, the themes are really strong. You look at your material and say, okay, I haven't got all of that in this, but I can manipulate what we've got. I know what I'm trying to do. And you kind of get it to the best it can be. That's the reality of being in an edit. But it's also the reality of being a documentary maker. You have a limited budget and resources and access, and there's 1,000 other things that are going on. If you know that you're making it the best it could possibly be, then that's all you can do. You can't make it perfect. I think that's where the calmness of the I call it the most boring process in the world, because it's just about bringing calm. It's literally, if you had a pocket calculator, it would be that unstressful. It isn't. But you try and like remove the stress from everyone. Say, everyone just, this is the best it can be.
Right. And I think with the science stuff, having done a lot of science stuff, it seems like a lot of scheduling surprises, like where you reveal. So you have your aha moments, and that can be every act. But that's me putting it in, and those are my words, not yours.
Well, my background is science as well. I began at the Science and Features Department at the BBC years ago, and I think that was always the conflict. It's like, where's the drama in this? I don't like puzzles. I like magic. You know, I sat across my desk in the BBC was across from a guy, very smart guy who loved puzzles. And I was saying, no, it's about magic. It's about how you tell the story. And he said, no, it's about being fascinated in the thing itself. And I was always trying to kind of work out where's the meaning. I mean, I was obsessed by trying to make something meaningful. And it took me, decades really to kind of look at everything and think, where is the source of meaning? And how can we really make it work,
And so, I mean, you've had decades of this, and you're talking about building that skill set so you can do these things confidently. That's something that you offer. What do you offer people to help them build that skill set?
Well, it's a course, really, a program. It's like 12 weeks long, and we just take them through that skill set that you can use. It's about taking any idea that you've got and turning it into a fully structured, beautifully told, meaningful narrative, factual narrative. Every skill you need really to do that job in about 12 weeks. There's kind of like, I do seminars over this system here. There's an online element. There's a community we've built up. And it's kind of trying to, the realization that it's a skill that can absolutely be taught, and how to teach that skill as quickly and as efficiently and in as fun way as possible. So that's kind of what we do. We've got this company called the DocFix, and that's what the DocFix does. It kind of takes people through, and it's amazing. You have people who've never made a film before, and you've got people who are exhibited at Sundance. But everyone realizes there's something that they could know, something more that they could know about the process. So we take people through it, and then they can use it then, and hopefully it'll save them, decades of work to try to work it out for themselves.
It saves them that moment in the edit suite where I don't know what I'm doing. Or I don't know how the story's going to work, rather.
Yeah, it gives you all the tools you need to kind of be so much better at solving that problem in every story you tell. And I think they're certainly enjoying it. And it's kind of people who've been through it are kind of solving their story problems.
And the storytelling is a mountain that you never reach the top of. Like, there's always something to learn.
Well, the problem is that you are part of it. It's like you are dealing, usually when you tackle a subject, it's because they always say in drama, like, write about things that upset you or you don't understand, because you explore it in things. So you're part of the process. So the best thing you can do, I think, is learn to be objective. Really learn to stand back, and really the more objective you can be, it means you don't have to come back to something after 3 weeks to be clear about what you need to do. It's actually, you can look at it and see it objectively, to have the tools to be objective in the moment, because I've got the tools of objectivity. It's not a mystery. It's like, these are the techniques.
Yeah, I've always found that the toughest thing in storytelling is to be so completely subjectively, passionately involved, and then have to step back and be dispassionate. That's always a challenge for everybody, I think.
I know, and that's kind of what you have to teach. And that's look, it's tough. It's always tough. Storytelling is challenging and fun and engaging, and you do it because you're exploring new things. But it needn't be as painful and expensive and time-consuming as it can get. There's ways of kind of calming the process down and then allowing you to be as crazy and creative as you want to be.
Well, Nigel, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed talking to you about this. People can find you at the DocFix, and we'll definitely see you around Congress. Thanks so much, Nigel.
My pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation and found it useful. Before you go, if your documentary isn't working and you want help fixing it, the best next step is the free DocFix case study. Just go to apply.thedocfix.com or click the link in the show notes. I walk through how I've used the DocFix system on series like Netflix's F1 Drive to Survive, working with Sir David Attenborough, and most importantly, with students in DocFix, so you can apply the same tools to your own films. If you're finding these conversations useful, the best way to support the show is simple. Share this episode with one filmmaker who'd benefit, and leave a short rating or review wherever you listen. It helps more documentary makers find this and keeps the podcast free. Have a good rest of the day, and I'll talk to you soon.